Hi everyone, my name is Vanessa Valuco, and welcome back to Personal Pans, conversations about belief, transformation, and all the weird and wonderful things that we experience. Today's guest is Jenny McGrath. She is a licensed mental health counselor, a somatic therapist, and a movement educator. She's also one of my favorite people. We found each other through a mutual admiration, which is always the best. I was a guest on Mega, the podcast, their live stream, and beforehand I figured I'd watch one of the earlier episodes. It featured Jenny, and midway through that stream I paused it and I emailed her because I loved what she had to say about trauma. I mean, if you've listened to a minute of this podcast, you know I will always talk about trauma. I will always talk about grief. I think that that talking about these transgressive things is imperative to the human experience, and she's just so fluent and accessible about it. So like I said, reached out, emailed her, and turns out she had just listened to my episode where I was a guest on Humanize Me, and she also fell in love with me. So she got to come on my podcast and we got to be friends. And you can probably see me like beam love at her if you watch this throughout the entire episode. Mostly because it's pretty neat when you find each other out in the ether like that. So Jenny grew up a fundamentalist Christian. She's another one of the ex-evangelical team in terms of guests, and she talked about even doing missionary work in Uganda and her path to therapy and to healing in the body. Just an incredible conversation, and I hope you enjoy it.
Again, oh my God. I think it was, I'm trying to remember, there was at one point while you were on the Mega Twitch stream where I paused it right in the middle and I was like, I have to message Jenny immediately. I need her to be my friend. Like, oh. And I can't remember. It was either when you were talking about like the vagus nerve and all of that, because one of my best friends is a therapist, and she has been talking to me about that for a while, and how that's like kind of becoming not really mainstream, but more talked about, but how there's still a lot of pushback. So as soon as you were talking about that, I was like, cool, she's at the cutting edge of trauma therapy. And then this other moment when you were talking about how like the experience of trauma doesn't necessarily create like, I'm going to use the word neurosis because it reminded me so much of Alice Miller, who's like one of my favorite writers, where it's like, you can experience something traumatic. That doesn't mean it's going to linger forever. What causes it to live in the body is if you don't have a place to express it, or if the people around you are gaslighting you and telling you that is not a big deal, you're overreacting, you know, all of that. It gets stuck, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
So,
like those two things. Oh my God.
Perfect, because those are my favorite things to nerd out about.
Great.
And I feel like similar and totally different when I listened to your episode on Humanize Me. I was like, this is so, like, I'm very new into a lot of the things that you're into, and it feels just like, honestly, it's been some of my like, I feel like it's been a lot of my like anti-racism journey that has sort of kind of opened up digging deeper into like witch hunts and like the connections of like sexism and racism, and just kind of this idea of like folks who didn't fit into these molds of like what they were supposed to do or how they were supposed to perform gender or things like that. And I just love just how you're thinking through tarot and all of these things in such beautiful ways.
Oh my gosh, thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah,
absolutely.
Well, yeah, it's one of those, because again, I feel like, feminist is a word that has gotten appropriated by TERFs, and that I find very frustrating because, when I was taking women and gender studies classes in college, like it was all about deconstructing these hierarchies and our values. Like, do we really want these values? Who benefits and who suffers from this? So how can we interrogate all of these different systems in our society and get to the root of suffering, and how do we mitigate, like eliminate it as much as possible? There's always going to be suffering, right? But like,
Right.
how can you cause less of it? Like, we can do
Yes.
that work to make that
Not
happen.
perpetuate it actively.
Yes, exactly. Yes. Yeah. And like understand, and I think that's like the root of trauma work, right? It's understanding your own agency and your ability to change your relationships and change your life and change how you engage with the world, and hopefully inspire other people to go on that journey. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And that's, I don't think all trauma therapy focuses on that. I think there's this, some of my pushback is that a lot of it, I think it's hyper focused on the individual and like, let's heal your symptoms and kind of this vacuum. And for me, I'm like, that's not what healing is. And if it's not in connection to who we are in our community, in our family, in our voting, just how we show up in the world, I think should always be informed by how is this benefiting others as well as just my own nervous system.
Oh, already I'm excited. Because one of the things, again, I've been in therapy off and on for about a decade, and really believe in it and see the value in it. And I'm lucky because my therapist also has a more kind of systems view, because what you're talking about is like disease model, the disease model of addiction, the disease model of trauma, mental illness. Like, yes, like especially for me, like once I went on Lexapro, I was like, okay, there's a chemical thing that's going on that can be regulated with medication.
Yeah.
But also, like, my experience is exacerbated by the fact that I am, a woman, right? Like, it's exacerbated by not being wealthy, right? Like, there are class issues, there are structural issues that are in place that have an impact also. And if you're only looking at the individual, you're essentially giving all those systems of oppression a pass.
Yes.
And like you said, if you're focused on healing your community, you got to heal your community.
Right. Yes, absolutely. And I think so many times, there's this journey, which I think can be an important part of the therapeutic process, where folks often realize my parents weren't perfect. And then this kind of pendulum swings to my parents were the worst. And, I think for many, many people in our country that can afford to get therapy and spend, myself included, spend almost a decade in therapy, then I hope there comes this process of, and did your parents have this option? Or what was the, like, how can we have kindness and empathy to say, yeah, my parents did a lot of things that damaged me or traumatized me, and they did the best they could with the resources that they had. And we don't really have a lot of collective ways of engaging or talking about difficulties in families or communities. And I think just holding a systems view allows a lot more humanistic view of how trauma happens, rather than this like demonizing, these are terrible people that meant to do me bad. And it's like, or they also had a lot of trauma and are trying to navigate that. And having kids seems really hard. I don't have kids, but like, it's just
exactly. No, that's a good point too, because I think I feel this way about so many things. I think people don't realize how much has changed in a relatively short amount of time. And I think there's still some stigma about therapy and just in regards to mental illness in general. But like you're talking about, like my parents' age, like that really wasn't a thing that you did, right? You just, I mean, again, my grandparents are Polish immigrants, right? Suck it up. Why are you complaining? You've got nothing to complain about, like that. Just stuff it down and don't talk about it, and work and don't think about it. And then it, comes out in all these other sideways ways because it needs to find expression. How many people didn't have access, even though there were therapists back then? The social expectations, right? Like, there's something you're only going to go if there's something really wrong with you. And if you go, then people will assume that there is something really wrong with you.
Exactly. Yep. And as you were talking about with, the impacts of gender, it wasn't that long ago that when a woman talked back to her husband, she could get a lobotomy, like there was serious risks to having a temper, or just like even just not fitting into what you were supposed to fit into, that of course there's going to be layers of what's going to happen to me. Are they going to send me away? And now it's like, of course they're not. But 50 years ago, 70 years ago, that was not the case.
Exactly. Yeah. You're hysterical and you're going to an institution and you have no say in it. It's all the men around you who are saying like, no, we got to lock this broad up. Right. Like, again, not that long ago, there are people alive who lived through that. So,
Yeah. That also probably comes from, I'm semi-obsessed with BoJack Horseman. Have you seen it?
Yes. Love that show. Yes.
I think it does such a good job of capturing intergenerational trauma and these things that don't get talked about, that just start to manifest in, like you're saying, what we would label as addictions or things, rather than like, well, why is this pattern happening? Or what is this serving? How are we coping with addictions or things that we need to cope with?
Exactly. Because again, I think in terms of like, okay, so the organism, like, again, we're these meat sacks, right? And the body wants to protect, like keep it alive somehow. And when you're experiencing this intense emotional pain and you have no outlet for it because society isn't telling you how to express it, your family, again, the people who traumatized you in the first place, they have unprocessed trauma. They don't want to listen to any of it. So what do, right? You look for these kind of socially acceptable ways of expressing it. I think about my grandmother's hands and that idea of like, it's like a trauma divorced from like context looks like culture, right?
Yes.
And again, I'm Polish and I'm Irish, and there's a lot of drinking in the culture. It's like, or could it be from a genocide and like being taken over and the subsequent cultural shame of that, and then on top of like, okay, you've been brutalized as a culture and then you're abusive to your kids, and that cycle perpetuates itself.
Right.
We don't talk about that, right?
Right. Yeah. And my grandmother's parents came over from Poland as well. So I resonate with a lot of what you're sharing. And also, it wasn't that long ago that Polish people and Irish people weren't considered white in America. And so there's this weird thing of there is white privilege, and that's a relatively new thing for Polish communities and Irish communities and these non-Western, Northern European descendants.
Exactly. It is so wild to me, again, because it wasn't that long ago, and people don't realize, like, that alone should teach people that whiteness and race is a social construction, and it has nothing to do with what you actually look like. It's what you are perceived as, right? And how you are othered. And so it's also strange to me because I have Polish relatives who are like major Republicans and Trump supporters and all that. I'm like, I get that people see you as white now. Do you remember like a couple generations ago? Because that was kind of different. Exactly.
Yep.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Of course, you're also Polish. Okay.
Yes, there's been, the more I learn about like Slavic culture, the more about me makes sense. I feel like.
Exactly.
And it's so funny because like I was never, as it happens, where there's less and less culture that gets passed down. So I think I maybe had like kielbasa like 3 times in my life. That was my Polish thing,
Of
you know?
course. Yes.
And so then, but then there's all these like little things where I'm just, I don't know, like there's so much, again, it's this weird double bind of white privilege gets us a lot. And there's so much that's lost in this severing of culture. And you know, in Seattle, we have this Polish home association that has Polish dinners every Friday.
What?
And so my husband and I try to go like as often as we can and just like soak up just people not speaking English and like something familiar about that. He has also a lot of Polish roots too. And so it's just like, there's something ancestral that's felt, you know, that feels really just amazing. I don't know. It's hard to put language to, but
yes, but that embodied sense, because I just, you saying this, I'm thinking about like my grandparents, and you know, they came to the US after World War II, and they very much raised me to like be an American. And so even though I grew up with some traditional cooking, like they didn't really speak Polish. I picked up some Polish because when they wanted to talk to each other and me not know what they were saying, they would speak in Polish.
So of course you want to pay attention to that, because
obviously you can't present an enigma to someone with ADHD and not expect them to crack it, you know?
Yes.
I remember
the forbidden fruit.
I must have it. But yeah, that like sense of loss of the, like this rich, thriving culture and identity, and like, and probably because of being called, you know, DPs, which is either displaced person or dumb Polak, depending on the situation, that the experience of being refugees, again, having to leave their homeland, and then trying to assimilate, essentially to be more white, right? And not have to feel othered all the time. But what's lost, right, in the process? Like
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it, you know, it feels connected to even what we were talking about with therapy. Is there was a lot of psychoanalysts during World War II throughout Europe, and what were they talking about with people, you know? And we're not that far off in how we treat refugees and immigrants and folks of color in our country now. Yeah. And so what are we talking about when we're talking about healing? Like, what does that mean if we're engaging primarily wealthier white people who can pay 100 and plus whatever a session, and we live in a country that is not treating most of the people in our country well, to be the understatement of the century.
Exactly. Yeah. It's such a, I think a lot in terms of trauma and healing, and especially too, like the alienation of just existing, especially now with the climate apocalypse and multiple pandemics and everything else going on. How do you reconcile with yourself? How do you get in touch with yourself? How do you give space to that gentleness and kindness? How do you foster that in other relationships? How do you defend those relationships against, as you said, all of these people who are like desperate to other and be cruel to people who are not like them?
Right.
And again, I think thankfully you as a therapist are talking about these issues, and not just like, okay, well, your chemicals are misfiring, here's the medication for that, and then you're fixed, you know?
Right.
Fixing is aside from healing. Healing is a deep process that requires a lot of work. It doesn't just happen overnight. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. And even kind of the idea that, you know, our nervous systems and our brains are doing what they can to help us survive. And so like the misfiring makes so much sense in the world that we live, where our bodies and brains are just trying to do the best they can to help us navigate what's all so new in our human history and story.
Oh my, exactly. Especially like being a 90s kid, and there was no preparation for that. This is a thing of the past.
Yep. Yep.
Oh, it's all happening again. Cool.
I know. I mean, yes.
So you just talked about how, you've also been in therapy for about a decade, and you are a therapist. What was that journey to get you to the point of helping other people?
It is an interesting journey.
Great.
So when I was 14 years old, and I grew up in very, very evangelical fundamentalist Christianity, and I was pretty immersed in that world, was homeschooled most of my life, and just kind of in this very, very small way of viewing the world. And so as part of that, when I was 14 years old, you may remember the Invisible Children documentary came out about child soldiers in northern Uganda. So as a 14-year-old, I watched that and was like, God's calling me to Uganda, and like begged my parents to let me drop out of high school and move there. Thankfully, they did not let me do that, but pretty soon after I graduated high school, I moved to northern Uganda as a missionary to figure out, I had grown up as a dancer as well. And so I wanted to figure out how to use movement and dance therapeutically, which was, there's so many things that obviously are problematic about this in terms of race and power, and also like stepping into a culture where they already are like, of course we use dance to heal from trauma. Why are you here again?
Oh my God. Of course.
But a lot of that also, like, it's so complex. There's obviously a lot of really problematic things about that experience, and a lot of really incredibly amazing and beautiful things about that experience. But after a few years, my body shut down with vicarious trauma and my own undealt with trauma. And I like broke into shingles. I was having what I would probably consider a borderline like nervous breakdown. I was pretty again, not to bring this word up because I actually hate it, but like hysterical, because I don't have a better word for that at the moment.
Exactly. I know. Yes.
Yeah. And so I actually kind of went to grad school in tandem, both to figure out, like, initially I wanted to move straight back to Uganda. So I was like, okay, I'll learn how to do how to do therapy and how to do it sustainably, and then move back. And even like you were talking about with the stigma, like I knew I needed help. And I knew as a missionary, I couldn't say I need to talk to a therapist. So there was this very conscious decision that my grad school required students to have therapy. So for the first like 3 years in therapy, it was like, well, I have to go because my school requires it.
Yeah.
And then it became like, well, I have to stay in it because my clients have a lot of hard things they're telling me. And it was a really long journey for me until I could finally admit, like, I have a lot of shit I'm working through. Yeah. And so that was just, it's been a very long process, and really tending to my own body and story and kind of unpacking why was it the most comfortable place for me to be as a 19-year-old in a war-torn village in another country, and why, like, what was happening in my body and my nervous system, and so kind of unpacking just the familial and the cultural traumas that we don't often look at as white-bodied folks. And so part of my journey personally and professionally is kind of untangling white saviorism and kind of this idea of like, let's not focus on ourselves, let's focus on those folks over there that are suffering, and where that gets entangled with paternalism and racism and all of those things. So
Oh my
I feel like it's been such this weird meandering journey that I
Of
hope that makes
course.
sense as I describe it.
Oh, it 100% makes sense. I mean, again, like I just had Holly on the show, like, and so many of my friends are ex-evangelicals. Actually just found out that my therapist is as well. I thought she was.
It's so great to have a therapist that understands that.
It's so good because, as you said, it is this very specific type of trauma and religious trauma, and it is so alienating. You're being alienated from your own body, from your own wants. You are programmed from a very early age to believe that who you are and what you want, and even the body itself, is a place of sin, a place of darkness, a place of evil.
Right.
And again, like you're talking about, like other cultures that aren't alienated from the body, like they understand, like, oh no, if you're grieving, like dance, move, scream, have
Yes.
that full bodied experience, because we are, again, like we are in these bodies. Whatever spiritual experience you want to think we have the flesh also.
Yeah.
We have to tend to the flesh, right?
Mm.
And that, so to me, that's incredible to escape. First of all, anybody who escapes, I'm just like, oh, good job.
Yes. It takes
Good.
so much.
Of course. And it's a constant uncovering, like when I was chatting with Holly, of like, stuff just comes up. And that's been with me in therapy too, where it's like, cool, I'm good for now. And then a couple years later, something else pops up. I call my therapist and I'm like, guess what? Do you have any opening?
Yep. Yep.
But you have to be open to that process.
Yeah.
And again, growing up, that specific kind of religious, like that expectation to be perfect, and seeing any kind of struggle as a weakness, or even worse, like a trial that God is putting you through, and you're just supposed to suffer through it and not say anything and not fix it, because again, there's no greater power. So what are you doing getting involved with like the devil, essentially, with therapy or whatever? So yes, so your journey, like, okay, yes, you didn't have a straight path, you had a meandering path, but
yes,
it's a clear path, you know what I mean?
Yes.
Like that all makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. And yes, and then to like, so when did you start dancing?
So this is this weird thing. I started dancing as a 9-year-old. I had done gymnastics before that, but had I had issues with scoliosis, and my back just like couldn't handle that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which, I don't know, and I'll never know for sure, but even in like the research that I've done, and I mentioned this when I was talking with Holly and Greg, of like our psoas muscle is really correlated to trauma, and it's really common when we develop tight or restricted psoas muscles that it then impacts our skeletal system as well. So I will never know with the chicken or the egg thing, but there's so many things that, my body, I guess I started to listen to my body in Africa. And when I look back, I'm like, oh, my body was telling me things all along. I just really couldn't listen to it.
Yes.
And so I lived in this weird dual reality where I was like a competitive dancer for a studio, and we did like very sensual, erotic, sexual dance pieces, and I could beat that on stage while growing up in the height of purity culture and having a purity ring and wearing like hoodies and jeans that were 5 sizes too big. And so it was this weird like juxtaposition, and I think that's also part of that rhetoric, is that you can be sexualized but you can't have a sexuality.
Oh,
and so
right.
Yeah. So I dance was the one place where I felt in my body. I felt powerful. I felt like I could express, I could do what I needed to do.
Yes.
And then when I was 14, right before I saw the Invisible Children documentary, I broke my foot in dance class. And so didn't like every dream I had about that felt like it was stripped away. And in that worldview, the narrative really quickly became dance was a false idol. So God had to take that away so that I would go do what God wants me to do. Because what better purpose than be a missionary in Africa?
Oh my God.
And so it's been this like slow meandering journey of me actually coming back more and more to letting myself dance. And I've done therapeutic movements and facilitated that for other people.
Yeah.
And it's actually been a more recent, you know, in my own healing journey where I'm like, that's great. And I really just love performing and I really just love like dancing and that's okay too.
Yes.
And I was like having a conversation with my mentor recently, because although the narrative isn't, you know, I performing is too selfish, so I got to go serve God. I think part of that is like working out how to hold privilege responsibly, you know? And so it's telling my mentor, like, it feels too selfish or something to just be a performer. Like I should be doing some kind of more social justice-y thing. And my mentor was like, oh, so you're still enacting white womanhood because you're just trying to be helpful to everyone else. I was like, oh,
dang. I'm gonna have to like go for a thoughtful walk after this.
Totally. I know. I'm like, it's so insidious. It's just
yes. Well, I never thought about that. That it yes. Wow. Yeah. That expectation. And again, it's just amplified with evangelicalism of like self-sacrifice, you know, again, who you are and what you want don't matter. What you're able to give other people at the expense of yourself is all that matters. Like that's your only value. Again, like you're talking about, you can be sexualized. God forbid you actually have sexual desires and want to act on them.
Exactly.
Or just enjoy your body, right? That sensual experience of the joy of dancing. Like,
don't do it.
Don't do it.
Totally.
You only exist for other people. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's what I love. Willa Watson was an Aboriginal Australian woman who did a lot of like social activism work. And she has this quote that I love that says, if you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. If you've come here because you know your liberation is bound up in mine, let's work together. And it's just something I try to stay grounded in. Like, if I'm not, you know, and it's that thing that both and like we're talking about, like healing, it shouldn't only be for me. Right. And if I'm not laboring for my own liberation, any service I'm doing for other people isn't going to be a liberatory stance for them either. It's just going to perpetuate white saviorism, and the system then continues to function, and me just continue to be a part of that system rather than how am I either complying with or resisting the system and what it's telling me to do based on my body.
Oh my God. Yes. I'm thinking now, I interviewed Iris Sonia Moon, who's in Reclaiming Witchcraft. And, you know, that sensibility of like, okay, we're working together, right? You like, as soon as you're like, I'm going to step in and I'm going to take care of the situation, you're objectifying the people around you. And her whole sensibility is like, okay, what is my relationship to the people around me, right? And so then you're meeting them where they are, as opposed to imposing your narrative about where they are and where they should be and what you can do to get them where you think they need to be, right?
Right.
And again, it keeps you, when you're thinking in terms of relationships, it keeps you in the present moment, and you're always engaging and you're negotiating. So you're like listening. It's not just, I got it. Guess what? I'm coming over. I flew over here. Let me tell you how I can save you.
I know exactly what you need. Exactly. I have no idea what your experience is, but I can tell you what you need.
Oh my God, put that on a t-shirt. Exactly. Yeah, because so much of that is bound up in not even like understanding that there are people in front of you who understand what you need. Like that was the whole point of like third wave feminism, of saying like, hey, we're getting a lot of perspectives from middle-class white ladies about what it means to be a woman, and other women have way different experiences based off of who they are, like again, class, race, every system.
Yeah.
And you have to, again, that intersectional worldview, like, okay, how do these different systems create a particular situation? What are the needs in that moment for all the people who are at that intersection? Like,
Yes.
again,
Yeah.
relationships, negotiating, actually just talking, really.
Right.
Like, what do you need? How can I help? Yeah.
Yeah, which I think is like just allowing, like being bodies, I think so much of it is like when it gets into this, like, I know what to do, it's often from this disembodied place that's not relational or intuitive or connected to, like, okay, how did we even get here in the first place? Like, why are you suffering? Why are you oppressed? Like, oh,
Right.
because we took all your resources, and just,
Yes, exactly. Yes. Well, surely the solution is more intervention, because
Yeah, I know. One thing you will learn quickly about me is like I'm a quote nerd, so I just like my brain thinks in quotes. And so another one I love that is it's from a professor, Feroz Manji, and he says you can't fight poverty. What you can fight is those who make people poor. And I love that stance so much.
Sending me, yes. Exactly. You bring up this good point, because like, again, we create these abstractions, right? We're going to fight poverty, we're going to fight the war on terror. It's like, what? You can't fight concepts, right? Like you can't fight a winning battle against a concept. You can be in perpetual war and again keep people in perpetual stress and adrenal fatigue from these battles, the war on, like
Yeah.
but how do you, like, again, fighting poverty with all this abstract impossible thing, as opposed to your 200 billionaire families that are destroying the earth? Like, oh, well, those are people.
Right.
Like,
Maybe we should focus efforts on that a little bit.
exactly. We can just tax these people and then we'll have all the resources we need.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Stop flying them to the moon and maybe slow down climate change just a little
Like,
bit.
just a little bit. Can we ban private jets, please? And then we can have plastic straws back. You know what I mean? Like, focus on what needs the focus.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So there was this other thing you mentioned that I keep thinking about, in terms of your body was talking to you essentially that whole time, and like not listening to that. And that like that, I don't know, I'm just like moved by that journey of like getting back into yourself, because again, I mentioned Alice Miller, like, she talks about her clients who had all these physical symptoms, and then as soon as they started addressing the real trauma behind it, the body released it, right? Release that pain, release that anxiety. And there's such a power in that.
Yeah.
And it also requires you to, like, I don't know, I think a lot in terms of like the shame that people feel about like illness or injury. Like when you're talking about like you broke your foot and then suddenly it was like God punishing you,
Yes.
as opposed to, random things just happen when you are dancing, you're stressing out your body. Sometimes things just happen.
Right.
Right.
Mm-hmm. When it's like 10 p.m. and you've been dancing for 4 hours, you might be a little fatigued, and you woke up at 6 a.m. for high school.
God, exactly. So like, how did you, and it might be an ongoing process, like how did you finally unpack kind of that, like seeing injury or seeing illness as like punishment from God, as opposed to, again, just coming to a place of like, well, stuff just happens?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, as we've touched on these isms like racism and sexism, I think for me, I've learned a lot from my friend who has a limb difference and kind of understanding ableism. And, growing up in an able body, there were things in evangelicalism that I didn't experience, such as people always wanting to pray for you to be healed or insinuating that there was something in your life. And just kind of learning more of those stories and the stories that we as a culture say about different disabilities. And so as part of that journey, I read the book Disability Visibility, and it's just a bunch of stories from folks living in differently abled bodies. And one of them, I just can't not quote.
I love it. I love it. Feed me with the quotes. I love it.
I can't remember which story it was, but they said, like, I'm not disabled because of my body. I'm disabled because of the way that the system is created. That isn't created for bodies like mine, and that was really a paradigm shift for me in kind of this idea of what's called healthism, where individuals are responsible for their own health and well-being.
Right.
When health and well-being is, one, very, very vast. People live in different bodies, and health crises get perpetuated because of socioeconomic status and class and all of these things, like who has access to eat organic or who has access to only have McDonald's every day, and kind of the ways in which communities are created where, there's, in poorer communities, you have to drive 30 minutes to get to a grocery store where there's fast food on every single corner. Whereas, there's all of these different ways in which how we can care for our body is not separate from these systems.
Right.
And so that's also felt like it's still a very unfolding journey and unpacking that. And just, I think learning how we are meaning-making beings. I think we will always make meaning. And I think it's also untangling the stories that have been told about what illness means. Like, if you think there's some omniscient being in the sky waiting to punish you and will do that through illness, that's not a very agentful stance. Like, there's nothing you can really do with that. Apparently moved to Africa. And so, I'm like, just kind of having more of a critical look at where these stories and where these narratives come from about our bodies. And, often like how our bodies, quote unquote, should function or should be. Like, bodies there's as many ways that the body is going to function as there are bodies on the planet. And that's okay.
Yes. And that it's, so you're essentially touching on this thing that I'm like constantly struggling with, because again, Alice Miller, my own experience with trauma and the body, and like the research on chronic illness and you're talking about scoliosis, like there is a good body of literature that shows how trauma affects the body. And, I run in like new age and occult circles. And to me, there's this like danger too. It's like the other side of this kind of Christian narrative of like, God is punishing you, where it's like, well, you chose this, right? Or again, your lack thinking invited this into your life. And that kind of stuff, I get so mad. I get so mad about it. Because it's essentially, again, very much like evangelical Christianity. It's like, well, you're the cause of your own suffering. It's not genetic abnormalities, again, like a toxic soil and carcinogens everywhere. No, it's because you didn't have
your vibrations aren't high enough.
exactly. And so it's like, it's, to me, it's always finding that balance of like, okay, understanding that there are certain things in my life and certain things in my body that are likely caused by trauma, and childhood trauma. And also, again, like, okay, but I have the ability to unlock these things to eat, like if I can eat better, and also not just me, but like, how do we fight for like healthier, accessible food for everyone? How do we protect the soil for the world?
Totally.
Like, talk about climate change, and now I'm always like, but the soil, this is what we really need.
Yes, totally. I know. I mean, I think growing up in evangelicalism and all of these reasons, I joke, not joke, that I think I'm getting better, but for most of my life, I've sort of been like a cult magnet where I'm like, oh, I'm just gonna jump into this new cult. And I think that can happen where it's just like, I think we crave dogma, we crave answers. And one thing my therapist would always say is, nothing's a problem until it's the only solution. And so I feel that way with like, yeah, you can take these things, you can raise your vibrations, you can do these things. And if you cling to it as like, and this is the only thing, and and nothing else matters, then it's just another dogma. And it's just another way of confining how expansive we are as beings and connection to this planet.
Yes, it's so funny because like I mean, you heard the Humanize Me episode I was on, like Bart, I think, really wanted me to pin me down on something, and it's like, sorry, man, I don't believe in anything.
Which is what I loved so much.
Because again, that's like again, I feel like I've been practicing chaos magic longer than I realized that's what I was doing. But it's that kind of sensibility of like, okay, this can be true for me in the moment. It can be very powerful for me in the moment. Is this the ultimate truth that is forever, for everyone, for all time? No, like, no, there's too much. There's too much in the universe. And again, our language is too limited in scope to say like, okay, this one thing that I'm able to articulate somehow expresses a universal truth. Please.
Yes. Right.
Get over yourself, and especially if it's some kind of like, again, because I'm a power of positive thinking, changing your vibration, changing your thoughts, changing your attitudes. I've done that in my own life and made incredible changes in my life just by changing the way I looked at the world and decided to engage with the world. Incredibly powerful. But again, if you think that that's the only thing, or that the thing that like gets me mad is the idea that like, oh, well, we chose to incarnate in this time and in this place because we knew we had to experience this suffering. I'm like, yeah, fuck that. No, I know, and I'm close to too many people who have experienced horrifying things. They didn't pick this. And to say that they picked this absolves abusers of their actions.
Yes. Yeah.
I just, that's for years, because I as someone who believes in all that, we incarnate and all of that, was saying like, she was initially really upset about like Hurricane Katrina because she, had traveled to New Orleans every year, and then said like, well, I realized that they chose to incarnate so that they could be there during that time and have that experience. Like, I don't. No. No, that's a no from me.
Right.
That's a truth. That will continue to be a no from me forever.
Right. Which I think, as you said, it's just another way of that kind of missionary saviorism mindset of like, I'll tell them what's best for them or what they're doing. Whereas like, I think it's up to people to decide. If someone wants to say, maybe I chose this and that's what I resonate with, but don't put that on someone else to say what's true for them or what's not true for them.
Oh my God, exactly. Like, you can't you can't make meaning for everyone else, you know, and nor should you, because again,
Right.
like you're talking about how we all have different bodies, and those bodies exist in the world in a unique way. Again, the meaning that we make for ourselves and each of us is different than anyone else, because of, again, our experience within that intersection of different, you know, systems of oppression, our childhood, like our, again, the way we look, like all of that
Yes.
determines how our view of the world.
Right. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm doing this training right now that's kind of exploding my brain a little bit. Just around kind of the concept of anti-racism. And one of the things it's doing out of many is kind of even problematizing the construct of human, and how like what has been labeled human is from colonialism, is from the bourgeoisie, is from this idea of this is what it means to be human. And so even in like diversity and equity and inclusion, what we're doing is assimilating and saying, oh, these people want to do this because they're human, and that's what all humans want, rather than how do we honor communities that might look incredibly different than our community, and that doesn't make them less than, or that doesn't mean we need to impose our quote unquote values or morals on their community. And it's just been this kind of mind-blowing, like, of course, and oh man.
Well, that, and it's, I think that a lot of people shy away from doing that work, because once you start scratching at the surface, there's no bottom. Once you start and are committed to it, you are constantly scraping away and digging through all of this shit that gets stacked on top of you and taught you that that's just how the world is.
Right.
Well, that's just it. And you're like, well, does it have to be? Well, what about this? What about this? It is constant. Everything gets questioned. I like living in that space. A lot of people, I think, are very scared of that space and don't want to be challenged, because they're just like, no, I feel safe. I might be very unhappy, but I feel safe in this space. It's like, yeah, but you could be uncomfortable, but actually really happy. Like,
yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think like I used to think I hated learning. And then I kind of realized like that's because most of my life it was like my homeschool science books said we don't have dinosaurs because they couldn't fit on the ark. And it's like, it's not that I hated learning, I just hated stupid answers. And I actually didn't know that like learning actually leads to more questions, and you might never actually have the answers, and you can keep exploring. Whereas like I felt I've always been a very curious person. And so I would be like, oh, what's this? And then it was just this super matter of fact, black or white, usually not smart answer. And it was like, okay, I guess. And so when you can live in that, like, oh, wait, we just get to forever learn. That sounds so much better to me.
Exactly.
That's just the way it is, I guess.
I hurt for you, and like childhood you that just got like, nope, slapped down for any excitement about the world and learning and knowing like, oh, again, I always think about like my college research methodology class, and the professor, he was like, listen, in science, you never prove anything. You only disprove and fail to disprove. That's the scientific method. Oh,
yes.
You're just always working with the best fit model at any given point. And there's a power in that, because you can always learn something new.
Yeah.
You always have a new way of looking at the world. You can always broaden your horizons. Like, again, that's exciting. Like like to me, there's a little bit of FOMO of like, oh, I'll never know everything.
I do totally,
I've come to terms with that, you know.
Yes.
Then I can keep asking the questions and keep reading and keep talking to people, and just like, oh, it's like, oh, what do you know that I don't know? Teach me.
Right.
It's powerful.
It is, yeah. It definitely keeps things a lot more interesting.
Totally, exactly. So it's not just, I don't know, some people are fine. I don't think they're fine. I think they've convinced themselves that they're fine. Maybe they are actually fine. I can't understand
Yeah.
people who are just like, no, I got it. That's it. I don't need to go exploring. Well, there's a whole world.
Yeah.
There's a
I
whole
have
world.
never been that person ever.
Right. Do you also have ADHD?
Probably. I would not be. I mean, I think I drink coffee and it calms me down. So I think that, yeah.
That's the diagnostic, by the way.
There it is. I know. I like pretty much, this is the problem of going to grad school for counseling, is that like studying the DSM, I pretty much was just like, yep.
It's hard. You got a whole manual right there.
Exactly.
That tells you.
Exactly.
Oh my gosh. So we've been talking a lot about bodies and reclaiming your bodies. Do you want to talk a little bit about your embodied sexualities class?
Sure.
Great.
Thanks. Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah. So primarily in my private practice for about a little over 6 years, I've been working with primarily cisgender white women who also grew up in evangelicalism, purity culture. And so the course is very much born out of my own journey personally and my professional journey and the individual and couples counseling me and my husband have done for years in processing through all of the messages that we learned or didn't learn about sex. Speaking of like curiosity and growing up in abstinence only education, there's a lot of dead ends there. Yeah. And so, so the course is a few different things. It's partly the sex education most folks never got. And so whether folks are in a relationship or single, it really is for everyone. And it really honors sexuality as a spectrum, including asexuality. So it's not assuming you want to have sex or you want to have intercourse, but it kind of expands like, what does it mean to be a being in reciprocity? And what does it mean to practice consent? What does it mean to practice pleasure? What does it mean to practice all of these things that might include intercourse? They might include a partner, they might include solo, they might include all of these different things. And then again, because I really believe that our personal liberation should always be connected to collective liberation, there's also a module on the history of purity culture and understanding what I call the trope of young white women and why there was such an emphasis in the 90s on particularly white women's sexuality and purity and how that is really intertwined with these systems of patriarchy and white supremacy. And so understanding that our sexuality doesn't occur in a vacuum, and the way that we experience our gender, our body, our sexuality is because of all of these layers and more that we've been talking about. And so the course is really, while there's a lot of content in it, it's really intentionally a process-oriented course. And so I can't call it therapy because it's an online course. And it is I hope, a very therapeutic and healing process for people. It engages really similar questions that I've engaged with myself, that I've engaged with clients for years now to help people explore. And so there's like video lectures for each module. There's 9 modules, and then there's a ton of reading in each module with different links to different YouTube videos or resources. And then there's like an over 100-page workbook that people can continue reading and just like, there's like coloring pages and just different creative ways of engaging the content. And then there's audio somatic exercises that really are meant to help folks just get in touch with their body, their breath, their movements in ways that feel safe and kind. So it's been a big labor of love. My husband is a cinematographer and editor, so he did all of the filming, editing, all of that stuff, and
Fantastic.
he did a great job. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Love it. So if people want to find you and find out more about the course, where can they go?
Yeah, the best place would be the course website. It's just Indwell, INDWELL movement.com.
Great.
And I'm also on Instagram, and it's just indwell_movement.
Perfect. Great. I'll link all those in the
Yes.
description.
Thank you so much.
My God, thank you. Thank
Yes.
you.
Thank you so much for listening and or watching. You can find Jenny at indwellmovement.com. I'm going to list her website and also links to her social media. She is fantastic. Again, I adore her. Please beam love at her as well. You can also sign up for her embodied sexuality course online. I've signed up for it. I plan on taking it. If you want a study buddy, let me know. We can share notes. If you want to keep track of personal pans, you can find me on Instagram and on Twitter for as long as Twitter exists at personal pans. You can always find me at Kali Butterfly. That's KALI butterfly.com. I try to find that username everywhere because soon we're all going to be bereft of Twitter. Thank you again so much for watching and or listening, and I hope you have a playful and curious day.